Great. I think we're going to get started. I know we have a lot to cover today. Wanted to thank everybody who's joined the webinar. And my name is Nick. I'm with Range. We build software to help build successful teams. It's used by a lot of remote teams, including Twitter and Medium and Carta. And we help people stay in sync and focus on what matters. And today we've been very lucky to be joined by Darren Murph, who is the head of remote for GitLab. GitLab is actually the largest remote-only company on the planet. So he has a lot of incredibly useful information to share. And Jennifer Ferris, who is the Chief People Officer for Terminal. Darren's actually based in North Carolina, and Jennifer is in Austin, and I'm in California. And Michael, my colleague, is joining from California as well. So we're covering a lot of time zones. So we're going to get started, and the focus today is on preparing your team for remote work. Obviously, recent events has thrown a lot of folks in the deep end with regards to how actually to get up and running with a remote team, whether you're a manager or an individual contributor. So we thought it would be helpful to put together some tips and best practices, and we'll walk through those today. We want to make sure that we leave time at the end for questions. So we'll stop probably about 15 minutes, and we hope to get through everything, but there's a lot to cover. So thanks again for joining, and we'll get started. So first, I'd like just Darren and Jennifer to do a bit more of an introduction, both on their backgrounds as well as with their organizations. Darren, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much for having me, and thanks all for joining. Interesting times that we're living in, but I think it's a massive opportunity to leverage a forced work from home to implement some infrastructure around remote that will pay dividends for your teams down the road. So as mentioned, I'm Darren, head of remote at GitLab. We are over 1,200 people spread across more than 65 countries with no offices. So we are fully remote, and it's been that way since inception. And I've spent 14 years in various stages of remote, in hybrid remote settings, and now in an all remote setting. And so I'm hoping to give some insights today on how we can help your teams regardless of the actual remote structure.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Ferris. I'm the Chief People Officer with Terminal. I'm super excited to talk with you all today. Terminal is an organization that really is your remote teams partner. We help companies, tech companies in particular, build remote engineering teams, mostly right now throughout Canada and Mexico, but we continue to expand, and we ourselves are a very distributed and remote organization. We're remote first as a company. My background has also been in just growth and hyper growth organizations, all of which were distributed in some way, shape, or form. And the last 5 years, I ran my consulting practice and built a software company that was entirely virtual as well, working on a product that was focused on helping teams be productive in that remote environment. So really excited to kind of share some of that experience where I can, and answer any questions people may have.
Thanks so much. So to dive in, we first want to just cover some of the basics of what we're going to be reviewing today. What exactly is remote work, how to think about it, and how it's actually deceptively different than normal work. How you can get your team remote fluent fast, talking about the challenges that managers face as they shift over from being a manager to a remote manager, and then shifting an entire organization to remote so they can be more remote nimble and remote friendly. And then we'll take time again for hearing from the audience around your experiences and any questions. And if you'd like to have any follow-up questions or track this, we're using the hashtag RWPrep, hashtag RWPrep on Twitter. So again, if you have questions after, we'll do our best to follow up if we can't get to all of them. So first, remote, of course, is becoming very much the new normal in the way people work. The number of folks actually working from home has increased 140% over the last 15 years. And 40% of US companies have offered remote work as an option in 2018 than they did 5 years ago. So they're becoming much more remote friendly. And 52% of workers actually globally work from home at least once a week. So it's a massive shift in the way people are perceiving the importance of remote work. And then there's an estimate that by 2028, 73% of all departments will have remote workers. And of course, the reason behind this is because businesses see the benefits. You're seeing the benefits in productivity. 85% of businesses confirm that it increases based on giving their workers greater flexibility. Companies that allow remote work have workers have 25% lower employee turnover. I know that's something Jennifer is very familiar with. And then people who work remotely at least once a month are 24% more likely to be happy and productive. So these are just some of the stats. There's lots more about how people are understanding the flexibility, the inherent productivity gains, and shifting really what we call the fabric of work. So as we dive into what remote work is, really looking that it's not just video conferencing and dialing up the IMing, right? There's a set of practices and approaches that you really need to understand and to help solve for the distance and the time that it takes. And it's really fundamentally different than on-site, especially over time. In the beginning, you're kind of, especially when you're thrown into it, you start to do a couple meetings, you start to figure out how to communicate, and then pretty quickly you realize how different it is. So I thought we could start by checking in with Darren around how would you kind of define remote versus distributed versus work from home, because they're very much not the same.
Yeah, it's a great point. The terminology around this is going to be really important. And so you'll hear news stories on this is the world's greatest remote work experiment. And I don't entirely agree. I think forced work from home through a health crisis is very different than an intentionally built remote work infrastructure. And so of course, people are remote when they're being forced to work from home, but there's a key difference. And one is planned and orchestrated and there's intentionality behind it. And the other is just because you cannot be in the office. And I'd say one thing in general you need to be careful of is trying to copy the in-office environment and paste it into a remote environment. So if you have upcoming boardroom meetings that are in an office that now suddenly you have to deal with over Zoom or at home, consider that, like, what is that meeting even necessary? Like, really think through the meetings, really think through what you were doing in office and think through, is there a different way to approach this now that we're all working from home? Could this be done asynchronously? Could this be done through email or through Notion or some sort of asynchronous collaborative tool? This is an opportunity to really look at your tool stack and investigate, are there any ways or any new tools that we could look at that would make our life more efficient, that we may actually benefit from, even if your team intends to go back to the office?
One thing we were actually discussing before is oftentimes today, because of the way in which teams are really oftentimes the focus of work and the way in which everybody's restructuring their organizations, that if you're working on a cross-functional team, I actually used to work at Google, and I would be up on the 7th floor, and some of my team would be down on the 3rd floor, and I would not really run into them very often. Sometimes we were even doing video chats just from there. So there's even kind of the idea of remote work, even though you're actually co-located in the same facility. So just clarifying work from home versus distributed versus remote is very useful going forward as you get more familiar with this. So when you talk to different organizations who are evaluating going remote, Jennifer, what in your experience, what are some of those top questions that come out immediately when they're just thinking of why they need to do it or what they need to do?
Yeah, I think, in my experience, the companies that are going remote for the first time, I think there's just an underlying fear or mistrust or a fear of mistrust. That anchors a lot of the questions. And the reality is that, to Darren's point, going remote is a talent strategy. And therefore you have to have kind of a top down and bottom up equally approach to how that happens. So some of the questions, that we typically get would be like, how can I make sure that they're doing their work? How can, what are the best communication practices and methods? And I think, those questions need to kind of, they're completely valid, but I think I kind of consult and say, hey, let's take a step back and actually ensure that the organization is, or the team maybe, because maybe it's just a team first going remote. Let's see how we can make sure the team can be successful in the way that, your setup. And that means thinking through, manager best practices, what are going to be the communication practices going forward? What are the tools that we are going to use? And really, let's define how we work. That means figuring out everything from how are we going to manage time zones or any asynchronous communication to, how are we going to hold ourselves accountable? How is each individual person going to ensure that they do get their work done and they communicate that information out? So I would often take them through various strategies and the thought process to build out that plan.
Yeah, and I'd say the one thing you'll hear, a common thread through all of that, is intentionality.
Mm-hmm.
And honestly, remote teams have to be more intentional about things that co-located teams should be doing, but we just have to do it much more quickly, earlier on, and much more deliberately, because it begins to fall apart much more quickly. You can't just have a series of meetings to kind of keep everybody in the loop or informed. And these are the things that your team should be doing anyway. The question of how do I know they're working is a fascinating one to me, because how do you know that someone in the office is working? It really comes back to an organizational question of, are you giving your employees key metrics, key objectives that are measurable, that's something they can actually work towards? And if there's any ambiguity in there, you need to get rid of that, even if you're in an office, but definitely if you're remote, so that way you can measure someone based on their output, purely on their output, instead of hours spent in a seat. It's not good enough to just be able to see someone. You need to be able to measure their output. And then with that comes the trust of, here's the goal, here are the marching orders, go about it in whatever way suits you best, and here are the resources you need. But of course, that requires the framework of ensuring that people that aren't in the office have a single source of truth to go to when it comes to process and protocol and DRIs.
Yes, you've given a preview of a lot of the topic areas that we're about to dive into. I guess first, maybe shifting over to how folks out there who have been thrown into the deep end, maybe in the last few weeks or about to, can come up to speed as fast as possible in understanding what actually their teams and themselves might be going through as individuals. So, when you first start shifting from working from home, this is often kind of a common thread that the first thing that breaks down is communication, followed by a feeling of distance or disconnection and kind of a fraying of the fabric of work culture. So you might say, well, I've used a certain type of approach to communication in the past, but I'm using that now and it's just not working for whatever reason. And then as a result, more and more, I'm just not tapped into and in the loop to what my team is doing. Because when we're in person and we have the opportunity to kind of run into each other in the hallway, by the water cooler, or swing by a desk, we really renew what are called these belonging cues. So as we've already mentioned, this idea of intentionality is really, really important. So in order to maintain that culture and that fabric of work, we need to really intentionally craft those going forward so that they encourage vulnerability and you actually rebuild that trust. And trust isn't something that's just established and then you're done. You constantly need to nurture it and keep it going forward. So this is probably something that if you haven't encountered it yet, you will be encountering if you've just moved over and your team is just adjusting to working remotely. But maybe we can talk a bit about what are some other things that you kind of common threads that you've seen when folks all of a sudden say, wow, for whatever reason, in the next week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, we have to work remotely. Darren, is there a certain pattern when you onboard people who haven't worked remotely and join GitLab that you see?
Yeah, I think you have to be intentional about informing people that when they're remote, they need to adopt a mindset of self-service and self-learning that may not be as natural in an in-office environment. So when you're in an office and you know that there's a sea of people around you, you feel like you can always just tap someone on their shoulder and ask for an update on something or ask for advice and guidance. But when you can't see anyone, you may need to consult a handbook or consult a company intranet. That would be your first step instead of reaching out to someone. Or if you do need to reach out to someone, it could be a little bit daunting to look through a sea of names in Microsoft Teams or Slack instead of just someone physically around the office. So acclimating to the jarring notion of a person is now a name in a box instead of a physical being, kind of breaking through that wall and realizing, no, the person on the other side of this double click we can actually converse in a Zoom call if we need to, and we can converse over text, and this is the same person. But it can be jarring if you're used to one thing and you go straight into another one. And I'd say from a leadership standpoint, if you're thrown into work from home, do whatever you can to minimize the tool stack around communication. People, if left to their own devices, will just simply communicate far and wide on whatever suits them best, which isn't necessarily the most efficient and effective way for a team to communicate. It could lead to communication silos or fractured information where there's bits and pieces here and there. At GitLab, we try to focus Slack on being an informal communication tool. So we expire all messages after 90 days so that work is forced into GitLab issues and GitLab merge requests. We want the work to begin and be discussed where it will eventually end up. And so we add that forcing function so that people communicate informally about topics, whether it's parenthood or fitness or music or the typical water cooler stuff. We use Slack for that. And then of course, people can spontaneously use coffee chats and Zoom calls. But you need to be intentional about that. And if you've been thrust into this situation, I would encourage teams to find a leader to kind of set those principles and send them around and try to get as many people aligned on that as soon as you can.
And Jennifer, it'd be great to get your insight into this next slide, which is really focusing on mental health and supporting your team's mental health as they make this shift. So when we think of loneliness versus being alone, I think it's helpful to clarify that being alone describes a state of being, and it's actually a benefit of working remote. People are able to really be much more focused in the way and be more productive. Loneliness is something that you really, really want to watch out for, and is a growing issue and trend in many parts of the world, because there's a lack of social interaction and a lack of human connection. And feeling lonely and being lonely is an emotional response to those circumstances. So they're very different things. But how do you counsel both teams and clients that you work with, as well as your own team, around just watching out for this?
Absolutely. And I think, again, I'll kind of separate slightly, like being thrown into this potentially in a temporary state and actually having intentional kind of a work from home strategy as an organization. And therefore you might interview in a particular way to ensure that people are set up to have a healthy environment working remotely. But if you're thrown into it, I think that this comes, and you're probably going to get this theme a lot. The manager is critical. The manager is critical to team success and for making remote successful. They will be the linchpin for a lot of company communication. They're going to be the linchpin for a lot of cross-functional communication and in ensuring productivity, but they're also going to be the first person that any employee should go to if they are feeling lonely, and the manager should be proactively checking in on this on a regular basis. So I encourage managers to set up, whether it's daily stand-ups just to ensure that everybody is kind of on the call at the same time, to have that just general touch point, to, if this is something that's new for your team, doing more frequent, just quick check-ins, how are you doing, that are a little more without structure and just there to support you as the individual. I think also, ensuring that anyone new to working remotely understands you should plan breaks during your day. One of the things, and it seems so simple, and actually I had this happen to me in my first few months, when I went remote, you forget to stand up some days. You forget to actually go and have lunch, because you can be so much more productive sitting at your desk because you're not being distracted by so many other external sources. If you plan that as part of your day, you can plan a lunch. You can plan, going online and having, that water cooler chat with people and have virtual lunches together. You can have, a time to take a walk. I think those things are really important for mental health and for ensuring that loneliness doesn't set in.
Yes, I think helping folks get into that remote frame of environment, you've already highlighted many things in the insight so far, but really reinforcing that rethinking all of your activities. That could be your day-to-day activity. You can actually go out for lunch, but also all of your activities from meetings, communications, and doing it collaboratively is really recommended. So even as a manager, just starting a collaborative shared document with your team and starting to document those practices. Documentation is super useful going forward. I think GitLab lives in documentation. It has some of the best documentation I've seen on remote work. And we'll actually have a link at the end so people can take a look at that. Really embracing asynchronous practices. So when you do an asynchronous stand-up, a daily stand-up is great if everybody can make it. If you have to have folks who are in lots of different time zones, that can be really challenging. So for Range, actually, that's one of the things that our product does. And people find it really useful once you get in the habit where you just take 5 minutes and just write an update where this is what I did, this is what I'm going to do today, this is what I did yesterday. And really sharing that out so everybody can very quickly see how progress is moving along and check in with folks. It's really useful also to make sure that you don't just say, well, we're going to kind of figure that out, kind of, and then we'll let's make do until we get back together as a group. Like we don't know how long this situation will last. If you build in these practices now, it actually will help your team's success going forward in a number of ways. So that's why it's highly recommended. And then again, those expectations, like when are we actually going to be around to collaborate? Because very quickly you can say, gosh, the way in which my day has been working in the office is very kind of delineated by when I walk in the door and when I walk out the door. It doesn't happen when you're at home, right? You could be always on, but when are people actually available, and just making sure that you actually set that up and set those expectations as a manager. And then again, reinforcing the documentation. When people start to work and you actually do say, when are you available and when are you not, Darren, what do you see as far as the GitLab team, because it has such a large workforce, and making sure that those expectations are set for when people are available and people aren't, slacking everybody in the middle of the night?
Yeah, it's unique at GitLab because we are all remote and we are across 65 countries. So we have almost every major time zone covered. And we do have a bias toward asynchronous. So if you look up the GitLab values, you will see that we have a bias towards async. So meetings are a last resort, and we use GitLab to do all of our work. And GitLab is a very async friendly tool where you can add a lot of context and precision around whatever project you're working on. And then people are allowed to read that, interpret that whenever they wake up, add their piece to it, so on and so forth. So we have a tool at the center of our workflows that is really amenable to asynchronous. And that enables people to have whatever working hours suit them best. But to Jennifer's earlier point, we're very deliberate about hiring for managers of one. We do ask questions along the interview process that will shed light on this. Some people work better in very regimented form, where they're on from a certain hour and they're off at another hour and nothing in between. Whereas some people prefer the freedom, autonomy, and flexibility of a non-linear workday where they can splice work into life in a stop and start fashion that's very deliberate, but works well for them so that they can be working at their peak productivity hours, not necessarily the quote unquote business hours. So this advice will hit you differently depending on how your team is set up. If you're close to being able to flip the async switch, I would recommend that you do it. The truth is we work in a 24/7 business environment. It's 10 a.m. somewhere always. And so if you can get your team toward that, you free them up to have a higher quality of life and to be more impactful when they have peak productive hours. But if you're in a situation where we were thrust into work from home, we just left an office, we needed to stick to those hours, I would say that in the short term, it's probably best if you try to still align with those hours and keep that synchronicity instead of introducing yet another new thing right away. But I will say, if as a manager, if you're noticing that employees are kind of struggling with the blurred line between work and home, tell them to be proactive about replacing the commute time on both ends with something proactively. Because if you don't plan for that, that time can just kind of be squandered, and you really do blur the line between I'm sleeping and now I'm working and now I'm sleeping again, and it just feels like one straight continuum. But if you replace that commute time with something meaningful, whether that's rest or exercise or cooking or engaging with your family or the community, ideally something outside of the home because you're about to be in the home for quite a long time, it definitely helps you mentally ramp into the day and ramp off of the day. And I've found that over time that helps people be happier working from home, it's too easy to just get caught in a situation where you haven't left the home, your home in a few days.
We found also that for organizations who may not be remote yet, or may not yet be thrown into the deep end, but that's coming soon, is at Range we actually always have a Wednesday that's a work from home day or work remotely day. And that actually builds up that kind of muscle memory of how to do it, right? If you kind of have the practices, but you're actually not doing it, it's two different things. So the practices are important, and it's important to have a shared understanding of how you're going to communicate, how you're actually going to collaborate based on certain times. But if you can actually instill a day now where you practice that a week, it really sets you up for success when you actually have to do that the whole week before being a full remote team. So just being conscious of time, I think, Jennifer, you already highlighted several of these. We're really trying to counter these initial communications issues, and also creating moments for culture building. So whether that's lunches, Range is actually doing, for the next week, because we're all working remotely in the next couple of weeks, or we know that we will be having just a lunch time booked where anybody can drop in on a video chat and connect with folks. We talked to, I think, other groups do this where they have, I think actually Terminal does it where you have happy hours that people can drop in on. Maybe talk a little bit about just how to run those, because those can feel a little weird at first, but then when you get to the pattern, it kind of feels normal where you're just kind of dropping in and it's a shared time. We also recommend doing shared collab times, because meetings start to creep in really quickly, because everybody, if you don't do asynchronous check-ins, you tend to default to saying, well, we're just going to book a lot of meetings to check in with folks, and all of a sudden your schedule is maxed out with all these meetings, as opposed to saying, let's have an hour on Thursday to talk for this specific team to have a collaboration session, and we know we'll always be able to do that there, as opposed to doing check-ins via meetings, because that can get overloaded really quickly. Jennifer, is there anything else you've seen, especially on the culture side, that's been really valuable for teams helping to rebuild those connections and maintain that level of trust?
Yeah, I mean, I think, a lot of companies have this tool now. I mean, something as simple as Donut that is, can get embedded into Slack. It kind of sets coffee chats up for two random employees that might not have the opportunity otherwise to sync. So we do that, starting with new hires on their first day, and it has an opportunity for them to meet people they might not otherwise interact with. So that has been really successful for us. I also would just say something as simple as the first 10 minutes of every meeting, 5 minutes of every meeting is social chat. Just a general life check-in. What did you do this weekend? And make space for the meetings in the agenda for that. Because if you just jump right in, it can feel very robotic, and you do tend to lose those kind of very simple connection points with people when you're not physically next to them. So it's just, instead of having someone come in and sit next to you and say, hey, how was your night? You can do that in a meeting too, and just kind of leave space to do that. So I think it builds those relationships. And then something, it's a little more formal in certain cases, but I do virtual offsites with my team. So we're all in our preferred location, but we'll do both professional planning as well as some social interaction as part of those virtual offsites. So I think there's a variety of things that you can do to again, it's all about human connection. It doesn't have to be physical in person. It's more about the emotional kind of touch points that you can create for people to make them feel included in the organization.
Yeah, I think that practice of checking in at meetings is great for any team, right? Just because oftentimes in meetings, you can be in so many that if you speak at the beginning of the meeting, it actually helps you make sure that you speak during the meeting. A lot of research has shown, and actually as part of Range's platform, we have a meetings feature where we have a randomizer for everybody in the meeting, and we just start with that. So you're randomly selected to go first just to do a check-in and say, oh, this is how I'm feeling, and that really helps people, one, understand just how you're doing. You don't know maybe if you were interacting with somebody, if they didn't sleep that well last night, or if they're stressed about something, and then that surfaces, and all of a sudden it just you have that sense of empathy and that sense of vulnerability where you just understand, it helps to build that fabric of work again.
I would actually also add, when you are remote, you have to be much more vocal about celebrations and celebrating wins, celebrating each other, celebrating birthdays, whatever it might be. But again, like finding ways to celebrate is something that can be very powerful and very motivating, and again, like lift people up a little bit.
It's a great point. And if you Google GitLab discretionary bonuses, I feel like this is a super simple, easily implementable way to do this. So essentially you can nominate anyone on the GitLab team for exemplifying any of our values. So it's not about sales metrics or the typical revenue drivers. It's purely about values. And then we celebrate those in a company-wide Slack channel. So everyone gets to see who helped another person, and we get to celebrate that bonus together. And so that reinforces culture and values well beyond onboarding. But to Jennifer's point, it also gives us a reason to celebrate multiple times a day and see people being champions for other people, even though we're not in the same office.
Oh, that's a great practice. I think that also probably, maybe when you're in the office, you're presuming if you have some type of celebration that everybody's participating, but if you're not around, you happen to be out that day, you don't actually participate in that. But if you can see it asynchronously, then you just feel it's much more collective and the whole organization shares in it. That's great. So now we're just going to shift over to talking a bit about the manager and the issues that they face. I think as Jennifer already highlighted, it's so critical for managers to understand the shift in remote work and what that means for them. And they are such the linchpin of making it work for their team and supporting their team. And it's kind of, we call it like, welcome to your new old job. You're a manager and you're a remote manager and your team's remote, but actually it's pretty fundamentally different and you'll have to adjust. So if we could go over, let's just get input from both of you around, how do you help folks understand how to keep teams in sync, strengthen their connections, encourage transparency, and then provide that type of training and coaching in a remote environment? Darren?
So at GitLab, we rely on the handbook. If you Google GitLab handbook, and I've said Google a lot, but the truth is we don't have an internal handbook. So everything about GitLab is public facing. There is only one handbook, and the handbook that guides our team with all of our processes and protocols is the same one that you can see on the web. And we are incredibly transparent and intentionally transparent because we want the entire world to hold us accountable. So if we ship something to the handbook, we have to know that that's good enough for the world to see, then it's good enough for us. And it's a continually evolving organism. It's the single source of truth, and it keeps all 1,200 people focused on that one repository. And it definitely adds cohesion. So if you don't have a handbook right now, I would encourage you to stand one up. And of course, the GitLab handbook now is over 3,000 pages if you were to print it, but it didn't start that way. It started as one page. And so if this isn't in your organization now, start with one page. You might could use Notion or Ask Almanac. We use GitLab to stand up our handbook as well. But I would use something with continuous integration so people can merge requests into it and make proposals. That way it empowers the entire team to make suggestions. And then you have code owners of certain sites, finance, engineering, so forth, that are ultimately the DRI and responsible for the content in that section of the handbook. But if you're just starting out, it could be really rudimentary. Tell people where to go. Think of it as an FAQ for your company. Who do they turn to when they have IT needs, if they have HR needs, so on and so forth. A lot of these things are taken for granted when you're in the office. You just sort of walk over and ask people who is the expert in this area. When you don't have an office to resort to, you have to write it down. So start writing down and iterate on it. It'll get better day after day. Don't get caught up in how daunting it is to try to compose a 3,000-page handbook. Just start today with whatever the most pressing thing is, and then you'll have that knocked out, and so on and so forth. And that's just part of the calming of the seas and kind of stabilizing if you're in a forced work from home environment.
I mean, just touching on specifically, managers, I think, one of the things that this, whether it's a short-term issue or, you're choosing to make remote part of your talent strategy, looking at your managers through the lens of how effective are they at managing in general, and then how effective are they at managing a remote team. Darren kind of alluded to it before. I 1,000% agree. those two things should be the same. There's actually a great manager on site should be a great remote manager, because great management ultimately comes down to the same core principles. But it does take a little extra effort, because you can't have lazy days where you kind of just turn to someone and have a quick side conversation, or just physically be present and therefore maybe hear things that you didn't otherwise know. So we have a learning and development team. We work with both in-house and with our clients on helping them build those muscles, those management muscles. And so some of the things that I really talk about are, setting clear purpose for your team, making sure everyone understands, why they're there and what they're doing, goals, clarity of role, like who is ultimately responsible, accountable, consulted on goals within the team, because a lot of times you have cross-functional support around your goals. So who's owning what, and being very clear about that, especially in a remote environment, that becomes very important, and who's going to deliver on what. And then ultimately, continuous feedback is even more important in these environments, getting feedback around how you're performing. So the manager has to be able to kind of take in, that feedback and then deliver the appropriate coaching as well. And so being a good coach, and then focusing on, career journey, career trajectory, conversations that, really interest the employees, because everyone's ultimately interested in improving their own individual performance. But as a manager, you should be doing that whether you're sitting next to your team or whether you're remote. But it just does take a little bit of extra effort to ensure that all 6 of those areas are really getting the right amount of attention.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that onus on managers is so critical, and I think for the managers out there, we all support you. It's going to be a lot of work, kind of, if you're thrown into the deep end, because you're going to find that you may think you're over communicating, but actually there's over communicating, and then there's really over communicating, and a lot of the writing and documentation can take up more time. But it is so critical, because as Darren mentioned, you really build up this powerful lexicon of information that you can then share out, and as you're getting the feedback that Jennifer pointed out, as you bring that into that lexicon, it gets stronger and stronger. One thing we found is, as part of range, we actually, in the check-ins, we have 2 things that is kind of the secret sauce that a lot of teams give us feedback on, and that's being able to just say with an emoji how you're feeling for the day, and then also answering a team question. The team questions then can be as kind of mundane as how was your weekend, to how do you like to receive feedback. And over time, we actually have 350 questions built in. It really helps the team get to know each other in a remote sense, because you're not able to run into folks, at the water cooler. So we actually created just a separate website with all the questions called Icebreaker. So if you're to the culture aspect, if you're looking for ways in which, as a manager, you can kind of facilitate those connections, whether you're holding a lunch and you just have people go around and ask a question each time, it really starts to build and have a better understanding of and humanize everyone. So I think we want to get to questions pretty soon, but I think we have about 5 more minutes to shift over and talk about, from an organization perspective, how can you help your organization be more remote nimble? So really building them into the DNA, building remote into an organization's DNA. And I'd love to get, Jennifer, your perspective, because I'm sure you often, as you're kind of the chief people officer, but you're probably the chief product officer, given that Terminal really helps engineering teams go remote.
Yes, and it is, again, I think going full circle back to kind of one of the original conversations, it is about anchoring this to your talent strategy. And ultimately, talent strategy is, how are you going to invest in talent? How are you going to use, what are the programs? What are the values? How are we going to anchor whatever we do for talent in a very holistic and connected way? And so it is literally at the core of the decisions that you make every day. And so if you decide you're going to go remote, this starts with the executive leaders, thinking through, okay, how are we going to ensure as an organization that we're going to set clear goals and expectations? What are going to be the communication channels? We've talked about, don't have 20 different types of communication channels. Really be purposeful about what tools you choose to use. And then you have to empower your managers, again, like going remote, you cannot, I mean, not that micromanagement is ever good, but it's even harder to be a micromanager when you're going remote, which means you have to trust and you have to empower your managers with the right with the right information, the right tools, and the right support to be able to ensure that they're driving productivity within their teams. And then, you know, the managers themselves, we kind of talked about that on the prior slide. They have to really think through kind of at a team level, what are their communication touch points? How are they going to be there for their team? And then the individuals have some onus as well. And this all should be kind of part of that DNA, how each of these groups take ownership of how they're going to make remote successful. And at the individual level, it is about, you know, how are you going to structure your day? How are you going to ensure that you deliver results? What is kind of the social and what's the social contract that's getting set, as well as what are the deliverables that you're committing to? And those, you know, and following up on those is really important, as well as taking care of your mental health. So making sure you take your breaks, making sure that you communicate how you work, how you like to be managed, all of those things. So though every player inside the organization has responsibility into really ensuring that remote can be successful. And that's ultimately, it starts by anchoring it to your talent strategy and really, you know, and again, that anchors to your values, that anchors to the programs and the decisions that you made it gives an organization.
And Darren, as the head of remote for an all remote organization, you probably get a lot of questions around, you know, how do you do it? How much, you know, having a kind of head of remote role or champions internally is critical to the success as people go remote?
It's absolutely vital. I actually just published a fast boot guide for leaders and teams today on the 5 top baseline things you need to put in place and implement immediately if you've been thrust into a work from home type of scenario. And constructing and rallying a remote leadership team is number one. Even for co-located companies, I suspect there are some embedded remote champions, people that have worked remotely in the past that do have expertise on it and that would love to share it, but they've kind of quelled that because they're in a co-located space and maybe it's taboo. Tap into that expertise. And if you don't have it internally, work with other companies, find remote consultants. It is important to put the onus on someone driving this, because this really lies somewhere between HR and operations, because remote is so fundamentally different. And there are some nuances that aren't naturally apparent to people that aren't fully acclimated to it. It's worth putting a team on, especially because as you enter the remote space as a company, you will have a lot of communication gaps that pop up. Where do those get reported to? You need a team that will field all of that feedback, prioritize it, and then do something with it. Otherwise, people will feel powerless to actually bring anything up and make the remote experience better for the team as a whole.
Yes, I think the champion, it really resonates that there's a lot of people who start to just train themselves up on all things remote, and then all of a sudden they're the ones that everybody looks to. But making sure that they can have both the stakeholders and those stakeholders can champion them is critical to the success. Well, I want to shift over because I think we have about 15 minutes left and field questions from everybody who's taking part in the webinar. My colleague Michael's with Range as well, and he's fielding them. Michael, do you want to start reading some off?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. So our first question comes from Israel, and the question is, if management is totally against remote work, what's the best way to approach convincing them that it's necessary?
I'm happy to take the lead on this, and the reason why I'm smiling about this question is up until GitLab, for the most part, it was a lobbying exercise even for me, especially early in my career, where a role that I applied for was not listed as remote, and the infrastructure really wasn't there to support remote. And so it's on the onus of the individual to kind of put together a portfolio and explain why this works for them. And I've even seen people go so far as to legitimately put together an entire PowerPoint deck with slides, bar charts, metrics on how much more productive they are at home and their portfolio of work freelance or otherwise, that they've been able to accomplish while working remotely. And then presenting that to a decision maker and walking them through the steps of why this works and how it can work through the organization. To Jennifer's earlier point, a lot of times you'll find that management is resistant to remote because there's fear that it will stir the pot, that the status quo will be disrupted. And so instead of managing through that and ripping the Band-Aid off and saying, look, let's address the future of work, let's lay the right infrastructure, it's just easier to say, no, this isn't allowed here. The other thing you have to consider is that in some organizations, there are portions of the company which can work remotely. Their outputs are purely digital. And then there are some portions of the company where it's not as easy. If there's a manufacturing component to the company, or there's specialized laboratory equipment that they need to get their hands on, it's not easily portable to the home. You are increasing the likelihood that there's a multi-class citizen type of arrangement going, where you have people on different playing fields. Some are remote, some have to go into the office even if they don't want to. So there are some dynamics at play if you're trying to get a remote role in a company that's already established. But I would say put together a portfolio, pitch your case on why it works, but don't focus solely on you. You need to focus on what you can bring in terms of remote transformation for the entire organization. Because if you can convince a leader that you're going to make their organization more efficient, and it's going to become a part of your talent strategy, where you can hire from a greater diversity of places, fill roles that have been vacant for a really long time, make it more than about you. Of course, it will benefit you, but it definitely is more about the team.
Great.
Yeah, I'll just quickly follow up. I mean, if the situation is for the individual to work remotely or for the company to have a remote strategy, there might be slight differences in play, but as an individual, I think it is important to even address, and Darren alluded to this, if you are going to be someone who has a different, like if you're allowed to work remotely but no one else is, what would be your recommendation to the organization to also solve for that? Because I think that's where it gets a little bit complicated if you are looking to be an individual remote worker where the rest of the organization doesn't have that option. So how can you provide both the data that's necessary to prove that you could be super effective, as well as how can you ensure that that won't impact the rest of the organization?
We have heard of some anecdotes with people who have kind of made their team remote without telling anybody. So in other words, there might be policies that weren't exactly remote friendly, but they realized, look, we should try this out, and they've used, they've cobbled together all the different types of practices and figured this out, and then somebody's gone, wow, that team is actually seems to be more productive, or that team, and what are they doing? And then they kind of build it out within. That's probably a little more rare, but it might be a way to try something out so you actually have some tangible examples that you can give in addition to all the data points and kind of the big business model and use cases.
Yeah. We have another question from Chris. Can you give an example of how to celebrate wins and birthdays remotely?
Well, we just, for Employee Appreciation Day, we gave gift cards to everyone and sent out, a company-wide email from the CEO for celebration of funding and different types of announcements like that. We've sent champagne to remote people. We have Slack channels that are very active and celebrate each individual, whether it's their birthday, whether they got a hire, whether they just had another win of some type or an anniversary. We also just literally before this call, we had our monthly all hands meeting, and we celebrate all birthdays and anniversaries in that forum as well. And that all hands obviously is a very large dial-in meeting.
From the GitLab POV, I'd say Google GitLab incentives. I think one amazing thing we do is if we meet our sales targets, we incentivize everyone to go have dinner on us. And then people take photos of having dinner with their friends or their family or a new group of colleagues that they're traveling with. and they share those back in Slack. So we have just hundreds and hundreds of photos of everybody enjoying dinner because the company as a whole accomplished something great. And I already mentioned earlier that we celebrate discretionary bonuses in a company-wide Slack channel so people can give kudos and give props. And if you want to take it even further, GitLab actually has a visiting grant. And so we will reimburse partially traveling expenses if you go visit another GitLabber in another part of the world. And so that's a pretty cool way to encourage cultural exploration. And then of course we get tons of photos back from that. So even though we're all remote, we still very much appreciate in person, and we do whatever we can to incentivize that.
Actually, we just put that in for 2020 as well. So all of the terminal employees have a credit to go visit another location, and we have 5 plus, or actually 6 with San Francisco, and then we have a variety of people completely dispersed throughout the US, Canada, and Mexico, but anyone can use that money to go visit any of our locations or employees.
That's amazing. Kudos. I'm glad to see that spreading.
Yeah, we actually have built into Range, we have a team directory, and we have, whenever it's anybody's birthday, you see that visibly, and that actually transports over. So when you do those check-ins in the meetings, everybody knows it's your birthday. And we also have a thanks capability built in. It's a feature, so you can actually link that to whether it's your check-in or your progress, and call out people in props, and that gets updated also in Slack channels. So there's lots of little ways but the thanks really, really matter. And once you start doing them, it's so easy that it just kind of catches fire and really helps the whole team. I think we probably have time for one more question, possibly 2.
Okay. I think I'll try to make this a quick one. The next one comes from Alicia, and it's asking about communication tools that you might use regularly. So beyond Zoom, which we're all using now for this conference call or webinar, what are some of the other tools that you all have been using for communicating with remote team members?
Right now, and we're actually doing a pretty significant just kind of review of all of our tools right now, just because there's always a new one. I feel like there's new tools coming up all the time. So we're always open, and we actually try to pilot as many new tools as possible just so we can know what they are. But for the most part right now, we're obviously very heavily, we have Slack, and then we use Zoom or Hangouts typically for our video calls, Donut for some of those kind of connections, or to create those connections. We also have Notion for our intranet. And so that's actually a fairly new thing for us. So we're building that right now.
Yeah, I kind of go back and forth between keeping it really simple and trying new things, because you don't know what you're missing out on, but you kind of have to have that appetite for at least trying things out. A tool that I've seen pop up recently that I think is really compelling is Yak, which actually plugs into Slack, and it allows you to leave asynchronous video messages. So instead of typing something back to someone, you can actually video yourself and then send it to them, and then whenever they wake up, they'll be able to see that, and they get a more personal view than just a string of alphanumeric characters. So I think that's a pretty cool one. And on the design front, there's a new tool called CoScreen that I think is really fascinating, where it allows multiple designers to share their screens and kind of cross-collaborate in a way that previously was only possible if you were sitting directly beside each other in an office with 2 screens and 2 workstations connected. So if you use design tools, check out CoScreen. Pretty fascinating.
We're slightly biased. We use Range for check-ins, for objectives, for team directories, and doing everything asynchronously. We also use Hangouts primarily for our meetings, and because Range integrates with Jira, integrates with Asana, it integrates with Google Docs and Calendar, we bring everything in really easily. So we're biased in that form, but the Yak sounds really cool. The idea that you can send those asynchronous messages, because often, over time, especially when you have really, really big time zones to manage, getting that FaceTime is, you got smaller windows. I actually used to work in Japan and Indonesia, and it's amazing how little I would see my former colleagues over in the US because you just didn't have that time. Michael, do you think we have time for one more?
Yeah, I've got one more. This one's from Yassine, and it's getting at kind of managing the delays in communication that are somewhat inherent with remote work. And so the specific example they gave or scenario was when you're trying to arrange a quick meeting. Normally in the office, if you're co-located, you might just swivel around in your chair or walk over to someone's desk. Those same opportunities don't happen with remote work, especially if it's more than just two people meeting. So kind of what are some of the ways that you all have worked around that and kind of get ad hoc hallway type meetings to happen for distributed teams or remote workers?
I can lead with that one. At GitLab, I'll just be blunt. We explicitly don't want that to happen. so we structure our entire company in a way that makes those very difficult. Because that swivel around, tap someone on the shoulder, let's do a meeting, it breaks their flow, it breaks their concentration. You don't know what they're currently working on or who else they're currently engaging with. And so we try to minimize that as much as possible. But a more practical thing you can implement is to have multiple projects ongoing such that having a delay in one isn't necessarily a blocker for all of the work that you're doing. So if you have multiple projects and you can compartmentalize, I need feedback on this one project, but while I wait for someone to wake up, there's also this project that I'm engaged with. It definitely requires intentionality on phase shifting between projects. But otherwise, you can get really frustrated on, I'm just waiting for one person to get back to me. Granted, this is much more difficult at a small company. As you scale, this gets a lot easier in a remote setting. And in fact, remote scales a lot better than co-located because as you get more people, time zones actually get easier. But in a co-located space, it gets much more difficult.
I would also add, to actually have criteria around if there's like an emergency, what do you do when? Because there might be a moment where, hey, someone's offline already, they're not going to see a Slack message. What constitutes an emergency need for immediate feedback? And then what do you do in those situations? Do you text them? Do you call them? Like use another mode of more direct communication. So I think it's important if there ever is, especially in smaller companies, whether you're just new to remote and you're just kind of getting all of this set up, all this infrastructure set up. I do think it's important to have kind of, okay, what do I do if, when, and what actually is an emergency so people don't abuse that.
Yeah, and I think just to recap some of the key points that came up throughout this discussion around how do you facilitate that fabric of work culture. One is just to make sure that, or to try different things. In the morning, we're actually just starting saying good morning on a Slack channel, and some people are just posting like a shot of their whatever their breakfast and their latte that they made or outside, and it just starts to kind of take off. Scheduling those collaboration sessions, we really advocate for doing asynchronous check-ins, because if you start, as Darren said, if you start to let that kind of grow, all of a sudden it takes out everybody's schedule and derails work. So if you actually have a scheduled collaboration session, it helps everybody kind of relax and go, okay, I know I'll be able to catch up with that person on this subject matter. And then just kind of engineering again those sessions that may be less about collaboration and more just about checking in. So those, having a lunch hangout or having a happy hour or coffee hour. Well, I think we're at the end of time. First and foremost, I wanted to thank Darren and Jennifer so much for taking part. We put this together in short notice. It was a fantastic discussion. We have additional resources. If you go to GitLab's allremote.info URL, you'll get a really amazingly comprehensive overview of all things as far as their playbook that you can go through and reference. Terminal has a blog with lots of useful information at that URL on shaping remote work mentality. We've actually just launched a remote primer for folks who are diving into remote work, available on our site and at this link. And we also just wanted to remind everybody, to stay safe, to check with their both local government and the CDC and World Health Organization for any breaking news regarding COVID-19, and of course, washing hands and elbow bumps are the new rigueur. But again, thanks so much for participating. Thank you very much for joining. And we'll be posting, and I'm sure GitLab as well as Terminal, lots of useful information going forward on how everyone can support each other as we shift over into a remote working environment.
Awesome. Thanks all.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye.